Hi, my name is Aaron Walker. I'm in the 4th month of praxis. In this video, I'm going to be covering some of the content I've been consuming over the past week, principally a lecture series on critical thinking delivered by Dr. Gregory Sadler out of the Fayetteville State University. Guiding me along the way will be this helpful list of 7 questions, so let's just get started. Question 1. What were the concepts that were covered in this week's content? The first 2 lectures cover the basic building blocks of debate or rhetoric, those being issues, arguments, claims, premises, and conclusions. Well, what are those? Issues are open questions that are best resolved by arguments. Arguments are answers to those questions that have a certain structure of claims that go from premise to conclusion. Arguments have to have this structure, otherwise they aren't arguments. So the basic building block of an argument is a claim, which is when you state something to be the case. It is a simple declarative statement. Premises are the first claims in an argument that basically you and the person you're speaking to have to agree on, otherwise that premise will be an issue that has to be further debated. So from premises, you will have a series of claims that lead to a conclusion. And the conclusion is what you're trying to get the other person to believe. Dr. Sadler says that there are a lot of misconceptions that students typically have, especially when it comes to misidentifying narratives and explanations as arguments, when they actually aren't. So if I sit here and I explain to you what I had for breakfast, or if I have like a narrative of what I had for breakfast, that's not really an argument. The important thing here is that an argument is when you are trying to convince someone of something that's held in contest, right? And an explanation or a narrative is just explaining how things are. The rest of the lectures cover fallacies, which are bad arguments of a particular type. Fallacies have the premises and conclusion of a regular valid argument, but there's some error along the way, some logical step that's missing. For the first lecture on fallacies, Dr. Sadler covers appeals to emotion. Appeals to emotion are basically, I feel this way, therefore this thing is true. The first appeal to emotion that Dr. Sadler goes over is expressions of anger, which is basically like, liberals are just upset because there isn't enough death in the world. And so the argument there is, I am upset about this, therefore it is true. Therefore, liberals are this way. Sadler also covers arguments from pity, so that's something like, well, woe is me, I'm in this terrible situation, you should feel sad about that, and if you feel sad about that, then you have to support this policy, or this argument of mine. He goes over a number of other ones, but basically, at root, all of these fallacies have in common, feels do not equal reals. In this lecture, Dr. Sadler also talks about emotional intelligence, which is the ability to recognize and control emotions in yourself and others. Dr. Sadler claims that emotional intelligence is actually more beneficial to you, is more important than IQ, than intelligence quotient, than your general intelligence. This is something I took issue with because IQ is one of the most studied aspects of contemporary psychology, and as far as I understand it, all of the relevant literature suggests that IQ is incredibly indicative of your success in life when measured by like your wages, your likelihood for ending up in prison, for completing college, these sort of metrics. And even like in the field of psychology, you have the big 5 personality traits. And as far as I understand it, in that category, disagreeableness is actually much more indicative of success than something like agreeableness. So I'm not sure that his point of intelligence is necessarily valid. But moving on, Dr. Sadler in this lecture also brings up this example of an experiment where kids are given a choice. And the choice is, well, you can either have 1 cookie now, or you can wait 5 minutes and we'll give you 2 cookies. And he basically says that the kids that have the 1 cookie now lack impulse control, or they lack emotional intelligence. Again, I think this is better explained with something like time preference. So when you imply that emotional intelligence is the deciding factor in whether or not a kid chooses the 1 cookie now or the 2 cookies later, you're implying that they all have the same time preference. It's just that the kids who ate the 1 cookie now have poor impulse control. And I'm not sure that's necessarily correct. A much better explanation would be, well, they have a lower time preference, which is also fairly studied in the field of psychology. High time preference means that you're less likely to delay gratification, and low time preference means that you're more likely to delay gratification. As far as I understand it, these characteristics are more or less fixed, so it's more likely that the kids that fail to delay gratification just have high time preference, and they will continue to have high time preference in the future, rather than them momentarily having low impulse control. But this is a very particular argument, and we need to move on. In the second lecture on fallacies, Dr. Saller goes over argumentum ad populum, which are arguments to the people, or based on popularity. He covers 3 different ones. The first is the appeal to popularity, which is a popularity contest for truth value, where basically you say, well, most people believe this right now, therefore it is necessarily true. This is the basis for things like polling. So if you're watching the news and they say, 95% of Americans believe X, the argument is, well, just because they believe it, it's necessarily true. The second appeal is the appeal to common practice. This is the belief that just because people do things a certain way, it is necessarily right or justifiable. An example of this would be you get caught coming in late to work every day, and you say, well, everyone comes in late to work, so you can't blame me for it. That's a fallacy. Show up on time. The third appeal that Dr. Saller covers is the appeal to tradition. And this is the argument where you say, well, we have always done it this way, therefore it is necessarily a valid way of doing things, or necessarily the right way of doing things. He gives a lot of moral examples for this particular type of appeal. For example, slavery, at the time that it was legal, everyone believed that it was moral based on tradition. So all classical societies in antiquity has slavery, it's justified in the Bible, therefore it's necessarily okay now. I wish that Dr. Saller would have gone over how to make a fallacious argument non-fallacious. So he gives the example of ancient Chinese medicine or acupuncture, and he says the fallacious argument goes something like, well, for 2,000 years, the Chinese have done medicine this way, therefore it is necessarily effective. So that is a fallacy, but I feel like you could just move some things around and it would quickly become non-fallacious. You could say something like, for 2,000 years, the Chinese have practiced acupuncture. It is unlikely that the Chinese would practice something for that long if it did nothing, therefore acupuncture probably has some good effects. It is likely that acupuncture has good effects. I think this is typically what people mean when they make an appeal to tradition. It isn't that, well, this is absolutely true just because people have thought about it this way in the past. It's more of, well, if something has been done a certain way for a long time, there's almost certainly merit to it in some capacity. And while this might not hold true for moral claims, I think it holds true for most other kinds of claims. Is marriage a stable way to raise a family? Well, for most of human history and most cultures, people have gotten married. So it probably is a legitimate way to maintain stability in a family. Is agriculture a good way to feed people? Well, I'm not familiar with any civilizations that have regressed to hunter-gathering. So it's probably a legitimate way to feed people. The basic idea here is that the extent to which things remain the same throughout history, despite the fact that history has a tendency of changing things, is indicative of the utility of that thing. This is the basic belief of Darwinism and evolutionary biology. So I don't think that it's necessarily a fallacy. Moving on to the third lecture about fallacies, Dr. Saller covers 2 wrongs make a right and red herring. The first, 2 wrongs make a right. This fallacy is basically a justification post hoc for a person's actions based on what someone else did. So you might hear this in politics where it's like the Republicans saying, well, the Democrats had their programs, so we should have this program. None of that has anything to do with the actual efficacy of the program in question. The second fallacy covered here is the red herring, which is when you evade the issue at hand in favor of something that just kind of sounds right. So if we're having an argument about abortion and whether it's moral or ought to be legal, and then you say, well, look at those protesters, aren't they just so vicious? That sounds like something that's kind of related to what we're talking about, but it's not actually part of an argument. It is misdirection. A variation of the red herring that Dr. Saller goes over is the smokescreen, which is when you just put forward so many claims and so many arguments that your opponent just can't keep up. So if I list like 15 different historical examples back to back to back, and then say, well, what do you think about that? you aren't necessarily going to be able to answer each and every single one of them right there, like in the argument. Which brings us to the fourth lecture about fallacies, which covers ad hominem attacks. And an ad hominem is when you attack the person rather than the argument. For example, X person is racist, and a racist can never be correct, therefore X must be wrong. One variation of the ad hominem attack is the inconsistency attack, which is when you say that a person's claim cannot be true because they do not abide by the claim in their personal life. An example of this is if I claim that it's wrong to abuse animals because the life of animals are valuable, and then in response, you say, well, you can't claim that animal life is valuable because you eat meat. Whether or not I eat meat is immaterial to the value of animal life. So it's fallacious thinking. Another variation of the ad hom is the circumstantial attack, which is when a person's circumstances are used to invalidate their claims. For instance, if I'm a professor and I'm arguing for higher tuition, you would say, well, you're going to benefit from higher tuition, therefore the claim is false. Dr. Saller also goes over poisoning the well, which is when you just attempt to vilify your opponent to the extent that no one wants to hear what they want to say. So if I say that you are like a child-raping Nazi, it doesn't matter whether or not that's true or not. We're not going to debate that. No one's going to want to hear what you have to say, because who would want to listen to that kind of person? He also covers the genetic fallacy, which is when you attempt to discredit a claim by attacking the source or origin of the claim. An example of the genetic fallacy would be you make an argument for cutting a program, and then I say, well, that's just what a Republican would say. And we all know that Republicans are wrong about everything. The last example in this lecture is the straw man, which is when you falsify, oversimplify, or otherwise distort your opponent's position just to make it easier to argue against. A good example of this is the Kathy Newman-Jordan Peterson interview, where Peterson would put forward this kind of nuanced claim about psychological personality traits and their effect on performance in the workplace, and then Newman would say something like, so you think that feminists have no points and they should just shut up? Well, that's a much easier claim to argue against, but it's not the one that he made. This brings us to the fourth lecture on fallacies, which is false dilemmas and slippery slopes. A false dilemma is when you limit your opponent to two options when there are actually more available. This argument is actually only fallacious when there are actually more than two options. There's sometimes when you're having an argument where you actually do either have to be on this side or that side. But if that's not actually the case, if there's a third option, then it's a fallacy. The second fallacy covered in the lecture is the slippery slope. This is when an action is assumed to necessarily lead to a number of increasingly unlikely consequences, ultimately landing the subject in a remote, dire situation. The professor gives the example of these 80s, like Reagan era after school specials where a kid smokes marijuana one time and then inevitably becomes like a heroin addict. Again, I think that this sort of argument, this sort of fallacious argument, could actually be rephrased to be valid. So when someone says to their child, hey, never smoke a cigarette because you'll get addicted and die of cancer, that is a fallacious argument. Each of those things doesn't necessarily follow. You could imagine a situation where a kid smokes one cigarette and never smokes another one. Or a kid does smoke a cigarette and then gets addicted, but he never develops lung cancer. But when people tell their kids not to smoke, what they're really saying is, don't smoke one cigarette because you'll be more likely to smoke another one and eventually to develop a habit. And if you are more likely to develop a habit, you're more likely to start chain smoking, and then you're more likely to get cancer. So while each step in this argument isn't necessary, you're not necessarily going to go from one step to the next, you're more likely to go from one step to the next based on the first action. Most slippery slope arguments are about the risk associated with certain actions, not necessarily about their inevitable outcomes. This brings us to the final lecture about fallacies, which is about begging the question and appeals to ignorance. An appeal to ignorance is when you place the burden of proof on the person you're talking to for a claim that you've yet to support. Dr. Saller gives the example of, well, we started this class with 25 people, now there's 18, they were all abducted by the CIA. The person he's speaking to is presumed to have to argue against that case when he has in fact provided no evidence that the CIA abducted anybody. Dr. Saller then moves on to begging the question. This is when you assume the statement in question to be true, and then you use the premise to justify the conclusion. There's two variations on this. The first is rephrasing the premise in the conclusion. So for example, we should lower tuition because we will decrease the cost burden on students. Decreasing the cost burden on students is the same thing as lowering tuition. You haven't actually made an argument. The second variation on this is the circular argument. This is when you support a conclusion with a premise that only makes sense with that conclusion. Dr. Saller gives the example of an argument that goes something like, God exists because the Bible says so, and the Bible is the Word of God. The validity of the Bible is dependent on God existing, and then you argue for God's existence using the Bible. So this is like an argument that just actually goes in a circle. So that covers all of the concepts that were covered in this week's content. Let's move on to question 2. What arguments did the author give for their ideas? So I'm not going to go into why Dr. Saller believes each of these things to be fallacious. What I will talk about is why is it important for you to recognize fallacies and the basic building blocks of arguments. Dr. Saller argues that these fallacies are everywhere, that they're in advertising, they're in political speech, and that if you cannot recognize them, you will fall victim to them and you will be lied to and deceived. I think this is a valid argument. I certainly see these sorts of fallacies committed throughout advertisements and in politics and on the internet and just about everywhere. You're going to encounter these, so you should be prepared. Question 3, what ideas were new to you? So I have like a liberal arts background, starting in high school and going through my college years. So I was pretty much familiar with all of the fallacies and in general, more in a vague sense, the building blocks for argument. One thing that was new to me is something I've already covered, which is that emotional intelligence is more important than general intelligence. That's something that I kind of disagree with, but I think the general point is true, that you should be able to recognize your own emotions and the emotions of others, and that this will be very beneficial to you in life. Question 4, what new questions did this content bring up for you? What did it make you curious about? The question this brings up for me is, why do we need this? Why is it in the curriculum? Now that's not to say, well, everyone should already know this and anyone who doesn't know this already is like a bad person or something like that. What it is to say is, why isn't this taught at a lower level in public education? If it's so fundamental to everything that we do and to our responsibilities as citizens, let's say, then why isn't it taught in public education? Is it just seen as useless or as unnecessary? And if so, what does that say about American society today? Question number 5, did this content in any way change the way that you think about the world, and if so, how? Well, it certainly made me more aware of formal arguments. So when I'm listening to debates on YouTube, it's much easier and much more apparent for me to tell when someone is thinking in terms of formal argumentation. Question 6, what are some ways you can use the ideas even if you don't agree? So obviously, if you're in a debate, you will be able to recognize fallacious thinking, fallacious arguments, and call them out on the spot. You will also be able to make a formal argument that's well constructed and valid. Likewise, you can utilize Dr. Saller's points about emotional intelligence when you're trying to convince someone of something, just recognizing where they're coming from emotionally rather than just logically. This is especially beneficial to you if you are in advertising, marketing, or sales, understanding how to influence people on multiple levels. Question number 7, what connections, if any, are there between the ideas you consumed and the ones you already knew? So like I've already said, liberal arts background, I was already fairly familiar with the fallacies, a lot of alliteration. The particular definitions of issues, arguments, claims, and their relationship is something that I wasn't quite as familiar with though. So in my line of thought, it's always been, here's stuff that we agree on, and from that we can draw certain conclusions, which are arguable, leading to an ultimate point. I've always thought that claims were essentially arguments in themselves, and that any given claim you make, whether it's the sky is blue or the state is an institution built on violence, all of these things are equally claims. I thought this because any sort of statement that you make about the world, whether it's narrative, explanatory, factual, what have you, is always a set of premises, each of which could be exploded, right? Until eventually you're talking about like Descartes and you're saying, well, how do I even know that I'm here? So this formal structure of arguments being, you have to go from premise to claims to conclusion, was something that's new to me, and I think it's definitely, obviously, a solid way of thinking. That's about it for this week's content. I really enjoyed going through the lectures, and I'll see you all next week.